Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. I am 34 years old and live alone in a large house. I was married and had children, but I got divorced a year before. This house is designed for a large family, but I have never had the time to move out, so I have stayed alone in a large house, where many noises constantly reverberate. This occurred on a Thursday night, after I returned home from a long day at work. The most frequent sound came from the air conditioner, which would make a hollow thud sound in the walls that would reverberate throughout the house, sounding much louder than it actually was. Don't get me wrong, it was unsettling at first, but I eventually grew accustomed to it. I immediately walked upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, jumped on the bed, and switched on the television in my room. I had everything in my room, so I didn't need to spend much time downstairs. I would only stay downstairs for a few minutes at a time if I was in the kitchen. After a while the TV was playing, I heard a familiar sound. I didn't even open my eyes, and I just kept sleeping. An hour later, I woke up, still not having fallen asleep, and was hungry for dinner. I turned off the TV and opened my bedroom door, and almost at the same moment, that bang, the sound reverberated. Without altering the thermostat, I have never heard the air conditioner make that noise more than once or twice a day. I wasn't quite afraid yet, but as I crossed the hallway to the upstairs thermostat, it was off, indicating that it had been off all day. I went downstairs to the kitchen, where the only thing I had left in my refrigerator was leftover pizza from a few days ago, so I set the oven and heated it up. I stood in the kitchen, talking on my phone, while trying to figure out why the air conditioner was running while I had it off. I was really just upset that this inconvenience had to happen tonight. I waited one more. When the pizza was finished, I ate quickly, since it was considerably louder this time and felt like it even shook the house. This is when I started to become frightened, because I hadn't really convinced myself that this wasn't simply the AC playing up. I decided it would be best to check the air conditioner in the basement. I didn't want to spend the entire night in fear. I just wanted to find out what it was and get rid of it. I opened the door and turned on the lights. This basement wasn't particularly noteworthy. It was unfinished and contained only some boxes and some old furniture. I walked down the stairs to the bottom, where there were seasonal decorations, and then I went to the air conditioner. I wasn't sure what to look for, so I was just scanning the area for anything obviously amiss, but I did notice that it was completely off, nothing was running, so there had to be something else that wasn't giving me the peace of mind I was looking for. Searching, I headed back to the stairs with the intention of checking a few of the rooms on the first level, but as I was about to do so, I noticed a figure crouching behind some crates beneath the stairs. The lighting was poor, but his eyes revealed where he was. In hindsight, I wish I had pretended not to notice and kept walking, but I couldn't control my reaction at the time. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed the door behind me, locked it shut, and pressed a kitchen chair against it. I knew he saw me looking at him, though we were making eye contact. I called the police while standing next to the basement door in case they tried to flee. I was afraid, but I also didn't want them to get away, so I stayed on the line until the woman said the officers were 3 minutes away. I didn't hear them following me, so I assumed they weren't here to fight. Then I heard it again. Someone was repeatedly striking something solid with hard blows. Based on the resonance of the impacts, I concluded it was the concrete floor or the wall, but I didn't know why. The hits felt too powerful to not demolish the wall. After perhaps 20 blows, There was silence for a short while before the officers arrived at the door and swiftly apprehended the man downstairs. Surprisingly, he appeared to be a very normal man, well-groomed, wearing regular clothes, and didn't appear to be someone who would break into a house. The officers also brought up 2 tools, a large hammer and a thick crowbar. After putting the man in the car and keeping him there, one of them led me into the basement to show me what was happening in the far corner across from the air conditioner. I don't know how I missed it, but there were huge indents of plywood and rubble all over the floor. Metal. It was a tiny, ancient safe that was built into the wall, and although it was nearly unrecognizable, the damage to it looked terrible, and I was surprised that it had held up. It's odd, though, since there was nothing inside. I do recall the vendor bringing it up and providing me with a code when we moved in, but I never bothered to hide anything inside. The officer I spoke with claimed to have seen it in many large homes in the neighborhood because many burglars go straight to the safe and frequently don't take anything else from the house. What frightened me was how normal the man appeared. Most I ended up fixing the wall and simply covering the safe because it is unsettling to think that anyone might be doing something like this. I also intend to move out soon and acquire a smaller home that would be easier for me to keep vigilant in because this could have been a far worse than it was, and I don't want to take any chances going forward. The second story, written by Anonymous. My parents took a brief vacation to celebrate their 20th anniversary when I was 16 years old. I pretended to be sad when they left, but in reality, I was thrilled to be by myself and have the entire house to myself. They departed on Friday morning. I went out, since I had no school tomorrow and no one home to tell me to go to bed. I wanted to stay up as late as possible and make the most of my time. I made a quick snack with the food they left me when I got home and then spent the entire night playing video games in the living room with my friends. A while, but my friends weren't as fortunate as I was, so at around 10 o'clock at night, everyone had to go offline. By 11 o'clock, or possibly even closer to 12, my neighbor's dog began barking, and even though their house was far from mine, I could still hear it through the headphones, barking uncontrollably for 3 or 4 minutes. Since it was late, I was worried and irritated. When I finally found a moment to stop playing my game, I woke up quickly and glanced out their house's side window. Their dog was still barking, and I was fairly certain that it was coming from inside as well, when I noticed a man walking through their yard and onto the sidewalk. It was dark and difficult to see where he was coming from. I assumed the dog was barking at the man by their house, so I resumed playing my game for about 15 minutes before someone knocked on my door. It made me jump, but I couldn't just get up because I was in the middle of a match. I continued to play while listening to the knocks, and when the match was over, I took off my headphones and heard them again, this time from the back door rather than the front, and then I remembered how late it was really perplexed and a little agitated. What could they possibly want from me to be knocking on the door so much at midnight? I got up, but I changed my mind because I didn't want them to see me. I reasoned that if they saw that no one was home, they would leave and return at a later time, and if they stayed, I would know. There was a problem. I didn't have to worry about that because all the shades were closed. I sat down again and played till almost 2 in the morning. I was exhausted and my eyes were hurting from gazing at the TV for so long. No more knocks came for a while. After turning off the TV and taking off my headphones, I walked upstairs to get into bed. I lay there for maybe a few minutes before hearing something outside the strange driveway and stopping directly in front of the garage. I listened intently as someone got out of the car and shut the door. Their door and proceeded around the house, but I couldn't follow their steps. As they approached the backyard, I felt a chill. I stood up and gently descended the stairs, still attempting to hide my presence from others, but halfway down I heard someone near the back door, who sounded like they were playing with the lock. I hurried back upstairs and dialed 911. They sent some officers to my house and told me to wait for 10 minutes until they arrived. I replied okay, hung up the phone, shut my bedroom door, and waited. I probably tried not to seem worried because I was a dumb 16-year-old and wanted to be cool. After a minute, I heard some noises coming from the back door, and then it opened. I heard someone enter the living room and make what sounded like they were packing things into a box. They went quickly through the downstairs rooms, but after passing through the kitchen, they left and went back outside. I was briefly relieved when I heard their car door open and close, but then I heard footsteps approaching the house again and entering the final room downstairs. I assumed they had dropped off the box and returned for more at this point, and I regretted not showing myself because the person downstairs seemed to believe that no one was at home, making a lot of noise, and felt comfortable enough to enter for a second. When I heard footsteps going up the stairs, music, I was still sitting in my room listening to this terrible thing happening below me. They headed directly for my parents' bedroom, which was next to mine. For a while, they were inside, and then they emerged and approached my door. The handle shook, and then the footsteps quickly went back down the stairs and out of the house. The car pulled out, and in a matter of seconds, my heart was racing, and I was struggling to control my breathing because I thought I might have to defend myself. When the police finally showed up, I told them everything, and they also called my parents. After they had checked the area and gathered all of my information, they were certain that the person wasn't returning now that he knew I was inside the house. Aside from everything, that my console was stolen, along with numerous other costly items. I'm just glad that whatever was behind the door fled and didn't try to break in, because I don't know what would have happened if he had seen me. In addition to being horrified all week, I had nothing to do until my parents arrived home. The third story is by Anton H. Working from home is great, but I frequently find that I get sidetracked quickly. On this particular day, I had a lot to get done, and occasionally I had to go into the office to pick something up or have an in-person meeting, but that would only happen once or twice a month. Not much time to complete it when the doorbell rang. I was in the office working intently. On my laptop, I hurried to the door and opened it slightly to discover a man on my porch. "Can I help you?" I said. "I'm looking for Mr. Peters." I didn't know the man when he said, "That's my name," grinning at me. "I am that. What were you in need of?" The man requested if we could speak in greater privacy inside the house, since he had critical information to share with me. I initially asked what the information was about, but he refused to provide any details. After saying, "I'm fine," I shut the door and returned upstairs to my office. Began operating once again after a minute, but the doorbell rang once more. I was furious because I knew it had to be the same man. I hurried back to the door and opened it, ready to urge him to go, but he had already left. There were no cars or anything outside the home, and no one was there. I peered outside and took in my surroundings before shutting the door once more. The remainder of the day passed without any further problems. After finishing work, even though I had to put in an extra hour, I switched off the TV and went upstairs to have a shower before going to bed. I turned on the water and waited for it to warm up when the doorbell rang. Once more I noticed that it was 10:30 when I looked at my phone. I wanted to see who it was, so I went back down and peered through the peephole. Despite the cover-up, I could tell it was the same man from earlier, since there was a man on the porch wearing dark clothes and a face mask. The way he stood and the contour of his body made my entire body freeze, and I just observed him through the peephole. When he rang the doorbell again, I could see that he had a large knife or a revolver in one of his pockets, but it didn't feel like any of this was actually occurring. I quietly retreated, but I believe he heard me because he called out, "I'm looking for Mr. Peters. Just need to tell him something important." Assuming he already knew I was there, I hurried upstairs, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911, but as I was doing so, A gunshot ripped through the house, which caused my ears to ring. It was quiet the entire time until I heard sirens approaching. Once they appeared to be close, I opened the bathroom door and went outside. I couldn't even hear what the officer was saying because the ringing stopped after a minute and I didn't hear anything else. I was certain the man had left. I went to the stairs and saw that the front door was broken open. The man then ran across the hallway and out the door just before the police arrived. I believe he had shot the lock out because my ears were ringing so loudly that I didn't hear him enter. I described the man to the police, but that wasn't much to go on. The man knew my identity and had been searching for me, so it was clear that he was at my house to harm and maybe kill me. That is what continues to frighten me until he is apprehended. I doubt when this happened, my parents were out of town for a few days, leaving me with the house. This was normal and never a big deal. Sometimes I'd invite friends over or something, but this night I was just enjoying the time to myself. I was watching a rerun of one of my favorite shows on Netflix while also browsing through my phone. I was 18 at the time, and it was the start of summer, so I was off from school and had no job. I spent most of my time inside the house playing video games, watching YouTube, watching TV, or just relaxing. When I heard a knock at the front door, I paused the TV and went to see who it was. It almost didn't occur to me that it was so late, but fortunately it did before I would have opened the door carelessly. I looked through the peephole and saw two men waiting for me to answer, both dressed similarly. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I should tell them who was home by asking what they wanted, but I ended up remaining silent and simply waiting for them to leave. They said, "Hello, we're here to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Ian," which was my parents. I changed their name out of privacy, but I was still apprehensive, so I kept quiet even though I knew it was too late for any kind of visit, even if it was crucial. After a minute, the men exchanged a quick glance and said something in a low voice before leaving the porch. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, but I never saw any headlights or cars arrive, which made me wonder whether they had walked here, which would only make things more strange. I returned to the TV, but put it on pause for a few minutes, so I could hear if they returned. It took only a few minutes before I heard footsteps outside the house. They went up to the porch, but instead of knocking as they used to, they began moving around to the side of the house. I got up and ran to the back window, and when they reached the backyard, I saw them open the fence and enter, so I hid away from the window. They started talking and then started to tamper with the back door, so I took advantage of the situation to grab my phone and hide inside the garage. I called the police to report what I thought might be a break-in, and less than a minute later, a loud pop sound vibrated through the house, and the back door slid open. Their footsteps then went straight to the stairs leading up to the bedrooms, where a door opened and they entered, then shut it behind them, but after that, there were no more noises. I waited in silence for 10 terrifying minutes until the police arrived at the house. When they did, there were a few footsteps upstairs, and then the two men began fighting. A few officers entered through the back door and fled upstairs, while another came to the garage and assisted me outside. The men didn't fight the others, but they also didn't say why. They appear to be searching for my parents, and it almost seems like they were going to wait upstairs for them until they returned from their trip. I consider whether or not I should have shown myself, and whether that would have prevented the break-in, but something about their behavior tells me that they were there even though weeks had passed, and it was fairly obvious that they weren't just robbing the house. I live on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in Wyoming, and the reason I live here is because owning a large plot of land isn't as difficult as it can be in most other states. My house is small, but it was comfortable enough for living alone that they would have still broken in and done to me whatever story it required. This happened 4 years ago in 2019 with spring, and we were experiencing a month of rain nearly every day. It was a Sunday, and I was at home from work, watching TV, and relaxing when I heard a knock at my door at around 6 or 7. Asterisk, I was even more shocked to see that it was a stranger, not a mailman or anything, coming all the way out onto my property, without warning, unusual because it was far out of the way. How can I help you? I told the man, who appeared to be in his late 20s, that he had been camping in the nearby woods and had gotten into some trouble. He said that he needed a place to stay overnight, and that if he wasn't lying, then it would make sense for him to show up at my house, because asterisk, I was the closest place in the woods by at least 5 or 6 miles, and it was pouring outside, which made me feel even worse for, however, that didn't lessen the risk of letting a stranger into my house. I offered to call him to arrange a ride into town, but he declined after stating quite bluntly that he couldn't stay here. Asterisk, I watched him walk a short distance down the dirt road before he turned off and entered the woods. As strange as that was, I didn't think about it for more than a few days. I didn't check the time very often, but it must have been at least 2 hours later and well into the night when I noticed an orange glare coming from the window by my backyard. Asterisk, I got up and moved the curtain through the fog and rain, and as the rain poured down on the small, flickering campfire beneath a large tree outside my house, I noticed the outline of a figure standing next to it. After a moment, I closed the curtains and grabbed my phone to call the police to report this person outside my house. Asterisk, I knew it would probably take an hour for them to arrive, and that whoever was out there wasn't hurting me, but at least I wanted them out of my house before I went to bed. After I hung up with the officer, I checked the window once more. When I heard footsteps approaching the house, I ran to the other window and saw him carrying a hunting rifle. He then turned the corner and went to the front door, banging on it several times before it became quiet. Still trying to comprehend what I was in, I grabbed my self-defense handgun from the hallway closet and HD around the wall, and he hit the door once more. This time, I could tell it was because his rifle stock was almost breaking a panel out of the door. I could only think that I needed to try to stop him right away before it was either our lives or our deaths. Asterisk, I shot around toward the edge of the door frame, temporarily deafening myself as the shot rang through the house. When my hearing returned, all I could hear was the rain falling. He must have run away from the house in the few seconds I couldn't hear him. After 5 minutes of no noise, I plucked up the courage to look out the peephole and saw an empty porch with clear footprints leading away from the house. Asterisk, the police conducted a thorough search and discovered some odd details, including the duffel bag containing evidence. They informed me that it was probably a burglary kit or possibly a murder kit that was planted beforehand with the intention of being dug up and used later, because it had been buried close by and probably dug up just hours before the attack. This means that whoever attacked me had planned it and had been right outside my house at least once before that night. Asterisk, which is why he attacked me specifically. Known, and his current location and identity are still no closer to being determined than they were 4 years ago. I continue to live in the same home and worrying daily that he might return. Story 3. When I was growing up, I lived with during my time in middle school and high school. My mom worked an overnight job, so I spent most evenings of the week alone from 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. I said goodbye to my mom, as usual, at 7:30 on a typical night a few months before I graduated from high school, and then I played video games for a few hours. Since it was a school night, I couldn't stay up very late, asterisk, but I still stayed up later than I should have. At 11:30, I turned everything off and went upstairs to my room to get into bed, but I was probably on my phone for an additional hour before I fell asleep. When I woke up, I thought I heard a door downstairs close. I checked the clock next to my bed and saw it was 3:30, so I assumed my mom had just arrived home from work early. I turned over and tried to fall back asleep, but after a minute asterisk I began to pay closer attention because I could hear footsteps downstairs. Normally, my mom would go straight upstairs to get ready for bed when she got home, but it sounded like as I listened for another 2 or 3 minutes, I noticed that they weren't even pausing. Instead, they were slowly making their way through each room, as though they were giving me a tour of the house. I became a little anxious that it might not be my mother, and that it might be someone else, so I got up and switched on the light in my room, and almost immediately the footsteps stopped. I listened from the other side of my door, but I couldn't hear anything. I cautiously opened it and peered out into the hallway, expecting to see some light coming from downstairs, but the entire house was dark, and whoever was walking around there hadn't turned on any lights, which made me even more terrified. I took care not to make any noise, and as I continued down the hallway until I reached the top of the stairs. I knelt down and peered through the railing to see into the living room. My PlayStation was still there, and even in the dark I could tell that nothing had been moved at all. In my mind, that was a telltale sign that no one else was in the house except maybe my mom. After all, if someone had been here to rob us and had gone through the entire house, they would have taken the most expensive item in the room. I just wanted to know if it was my mom or if I was experiencing strange auditory hallucinations. I went down the stairs. I went to the bottom and called out, "Mom, you're home," but there was no answer or movement in the entire house, so I went straight through the hallway into the kitchen. As soon as I saw a shoe print on the tile floors, I looked up and saw a man sitting at the dining table. He had a dark mask on, and his clothes were all black, making it hard to see his features. He was staring at me, but I called 911, and the operator kept me informed about the police's expected arrival. But after a minute I heard the man slowly cross the downstairs and head to the bottom of the staircase. I was whispering to the operator in a panic until I heard the front door open and the man leaving the house. He didn't say anything or even move, just stared at me with a faceless expression. I immediately ran back upstairs and locked myself in my room. When my mom pulled into the driveway with headlights shining through the window, I hurried outside to meet her and tell her what was happening. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough search and found nothing that would lead them to the man. But based on what I've seen, the man wasn't there to rob us and didn't seem interested in me either, which suggests that he was probably trying to harm or kidnap my mom. That would explain why he broke in just minutes before my mom's usual time home, which makes me wonder what could have happened. I'm 32, and I live alone in a rural house with a few neighbors half a mile down that I talk to occasionally, but I mostly keep to myself and only go into town when I need to. What would have happened if I hadn't gone downstairs to see who was there, or if my mom had arrived home a minute earlier and gone inside without realizing the man who was waiting for story 4. I'm almost retired. Although I spend most of my time at home, I work as a contractor for a few months out of the year. On this particular day, it was late fall, and I was gathering all of my equipment from the yard and putting it in the shed in preparation for the winter. It was just a few lawnmowers and other tools that I had left out anyhow, but as I was outside, I noticed something strange. A man was strolling down the road that led to my driveway. He was wearing nothing. For context, the road he was on was completely deserted except for a few houses like mine, and the town was 4 hours away by foot. I watched him until he vanished far down the road, and when he did, I looked down in both directions and saw no cars on the roadside. It was strange, but after a while I stopped thinking about it and finished my yard. I made dinner before dark and sat there cooling down when I heard a loud thud outside that startled me from the table. It was a wooden thump that seemed to have come from the area where the shed was. I looked out the window into the yard and saw that the shed's door was wide open. It was old, but the door had never unlatched like that before, so I wasn't sure what was going on, but I knew I had to check on it. When I got to the open shed door, I switched on my flashlight and shone it. I had my rifle with me just in case, but I was sure there wouldn't be anything dangerous. I listened intently to lead, and heard nothing but the silence of the night as I walked out to the shed. I also looked around the field and saw no signs of people or wildlife. Nothing seemed out of place inside, so I stepped in and looked more thoroughly for any animals hiding, but nothing was there. I made sure everything was secure here and closed the shed door before I started to walk back. As I was walking across the field toward my house, I had a spooky feeling that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it kept getting stronger. When I got to the front door, I stepped in and locked and my heart began to race as I held my rifle up and took a deep breath. Before carefully approaching the door, I leaned my head against the wood and listened to what sounded like someone breathing directly on the other side before I could even consider what had happened. I had noticed a shoe print on the floor as I entered the hallway and turned on the light. Across the hallway was a line of filthy shoe prints leading up to the spare bedroom. A man appeared to be about to charge at me with a huge metal shovel in his hand, but I believe my gun stopped him in his tracks. He stood in the doorway with the shovel like a weapon and his face full of rage. I yelled as loudly as I could for him to stay back, trying to sound intimidating, but I was definitely terrified. The handle twisted out of my grasp and the door swung open, so I leapt back and held the rifle up. Faded away from this moment, but I wasn't sure what to do. If I called the police, they probably wouldn't be able to get here for an hour, and I didn't want to risk anything by holding him at gunpoint for that long. As we stood in a strange silence, the man suddenly threw the shovel at me and ran back into the room. I ran in to see what he was doing, and as I watched him begin to crawl out of the window, part of me wanted to stop him, but another part of me couldn't get. I can only say that if I hadn't had my rifle in my hands or if he had gotten the jump on me, I probably wouldn't be here today. He jumped out and fled into the field in the middle of the vast, empty night, and I had no idea where he was going. To this day, that man has never been identified, and his intentions are unknown. Story 5. Since I rarely travel outside of town, this was one of the few occasions I've had to stay somewhere other than at a friend's or family member's house. The area I had to stay in was small, and the majority of the hotels didn't look very nice, so I was surprised to see a single house listed on Airbnb. I had never used the website before, but the house looked like a decent place, much better than the following week. I started the drive to the town, which was about 14 hours from my city. It was well into the night, and the town almost looked deserted compared to where I was used to living. All the houses had their lights off, all the stores were closed, and no cars or people were out. Of course, it was the middle of the night, so I didn't expect this smaller street that led to the Airbnb was dark as well, leading through a winding forested neighborhood until I finally arrived at the house. It was one of a few that had its porch and outdoor lights on, but one window upstairs had a light coming through it as well. I assumed the last customer had simply made the mistake of leaving it on. The town was lit up and bustling at this time, but it was still eerie considering I hadn't seen it during the day. I didn't give it much thought, so I started gathering my belongings and heading to the front door. I got the key code from my email, opened the door, went inside, and locked the door behind me. I hurriedly placed my belongings in the room's corner before heading upstairs to switch off the light that was left on. It was one of the spare bedrooms, and it only had a bed and a small dresser. I then went to the main bedroom to arrange my belongings because I was only going to be there late into the next day. I stayed up for no more than an hour before going to bed and sleeping. I tried to sleep but ended up lying awake for a while, so I sat up quickly when I heard a thud go through the house's walls. I stared at the door, trying to think of what might have caused the sound, but I couldn't think of anything, so I got up to I opened the door gently and peered into the upstairs hallway. It was dark and silent, and the only sound left was the house swaying in the wind. I took a step back and quietly closed the door, but as I stood there, I had a weird feeling that made me wait while I considered the sound I had heard. Soft creaks began to move along the floorboards from the other room, and I listened with my ear against the door as the creaking moved into the hallway and then started moving toward the door. I was so shocked that I almost didn't realize it had to be someone's footsteps approaching, and my heart began racing as they approached the opposite side of the door. I gripped the door handle tightly to prevent it from moving, and a moment later I felt it pull down. Shortly after I resisted, they eased off, and then the handle was suddenly forced down. After a struggle, I managed to push the door back into the latch and lock it. The man on the other side attempted to get it back open, but after yelling a few offensive words at me, he fled. They slammed into the door, and it swung half open before I pressed my body back into it. I only saw half of their face in the doorway, but there was anger in their eyes that I never thought I would ever see. The owner of the Airbnb continued the case after I left the next day, but I wish I had followed up with it, because that man seemed so desperate to get into my room and was in some sort of rage, as if he wanted to hurt me. I was still catching my breath and my mind was racing, but I pulled myself together and called 911 for such a small town. Story 6. About 3 years ago, I was on vacation visiting my brother, who lives 6 hours away, and I was staying in a rental house. Everything about it is unsettling, and I doubt I'll ever be able to get it out of my head, but I probably won't be using Airbnb again for a while. He only has a 1-bedroom apartment, so I don't get to see him very often. When I do see him, I have to stay somewhere else, because the house I rented out was very close to my brother's apartment, and it was the same price as hotels nearby. So, it was simple to choose the house. I had arrived in town early, met my brother for lunch, got some groceries, and returned to the rental at around 5 o'clock. The place didn't have much to offer other than a bed and a couch TV, but I didn't have high expectations for the price, so I stayed up until 9 o'clock and went to bed. After a long day, I was hoping to get some rest, so I lay in bed for longer than I wanted to before falling asleep an hour later. When I opened my eyes, the room was completely dark, and I could tell it was the middle of the night before I could even check the time, but I heard footsteps slowly moving down the hallway. After a minute of no more noise, I got up and looked into the hallway at the far end, where I could see the front door, which I knew was the door I'd heard them close, but wasn't sure if they were still in the house or had left. I walked quietly through the other rooms without seeing anyone. Then there was a door closing softly, followed by silence. It felt like my entire body had frozen, lying in the bed motionless and staring through the dark room. The front door was unlocked, which was the only indication that they had been here. I checked all the doors and found no footprints or missing items. I called 911, and they arrived rather quickly, but did little more than tell me to make sure all the doors were locked and to get in touch with the owner. Aside from their pointless advice, they showed no interest in solving the problem, so I stayed up that night and waited until morning, unable to sleep. After speaking with the rental's owner and explaining what had happened, I was out until late that day, but after having dinner and drinks with my brother and being dropped off at the rental sometime between 8 o'clock and 99, I went to the couch and sat down feeling drowsy, but also anxious about the situation again. Every time my eyes were about to close, my head would be filled with fear of the intruder returning. The owner informed me that he had changed the PIN code on the door, which did make me feel much better. I decided to go through the house again and check the rooms in the hopes of calming my mind, because I knew I needed to sleep tonight after not getting any last night. I went through the kitchen and living room before heading down the hallway to the bedroom, opened the closet, and checked the attached bathroom. Just before I left, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway toward the bedroom I was in. I turned the corner and only saw a big man as I heard his footsteps leaving the bedroom and heading toward the living room, so I stood there and listened. He traveled around the living room and kitchen for about 2 minutes before I heard the front door open and close behind him. The police arrived shortly after I called again, and this time the homeowner also arrived. The living room and kitchen appeared to have been ransacked, with furniture strewn everywhere, and after a closer inspection, the owner found that the cabinets were all open, and that the contents had been thrown all over the floor. It appeared that the man was searching for a specific item and nothing else. I left the rental and checked into a hotel, but I never heard anything more for a few days. I assume he was never found, but the situation has left me with a lot of questions about something that really gets to me. I was 22 at the time and lived in a little one-bedroom house in the house, so I examined the entire place that one night to see where he was hiding, how long he had been there with me, if he was watching me, and what would have happened if I had fallen asleep on the Story 7 couch. After work on a Friday night, I went online to play games with some friends. It was the ideal night to stay up late, because there was a lot of rain outside, and there was no work or school the following day. We played for about 2 hours before I was briefly distracted by a thump that sounded like it was coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it might be a roof leak. Rainfall prompted me to hurry upstairs to check the only rooms there, a single bedroom and a half bathroom. I saw no evidence of leaks in either of these rooms, so I hurried back downstairs and rejoined my friends online, which I had been using for some time before disconnecting at 2 a.m. Since everyone else had gone to bed, I turned everything off and sat on the couch with some snacks while watching you on YouTube on my phone. After 10 minutes, I heard another thump, this time from upstairs, but it was so muffled that it sounded almost like it was on the roof or something. I searched my bedroom and bathroom upstairs even more thoroughly, but nothing was visible to explain the sound, so I was certain it wasn't after 10 minutes of searching. I was so determined to find out why the house was vibrating through the walls, like something was hitting it, that I put on my shoes and went outside into the rain to see if there was anything more noticeable. At first, I saw nothing noteworthy, but then I noticed a tree branch approaching the side of my house. It was a large, sturdy branch, but it was at least 3 or 4 times away from the side, and even in the rain, it wasn't really swaying all that much. I had no idea that this house had an attic, because the hatch was nowhere to be seen and the roof wasn't a steep slope, so it didn't seem like there would even be room for one. However, as I continued to look at it, I noticed that there was a small window on the house that the tree kind of covered up, and it was higher than my bedroom window. This hidden window was the first I'd ever seen to show that there is an attic. I entered it with even greater curiosity than before and began looking for the hatch I knew I had to have somewhere. It took a minute, but I eventually located it inside my bedroom closet. It was tiny, perfectly smooth, and the ceiling essentially blended in except for the tiny gaps where it opens. I got up on a box and pulled it down, releasing the rusty ladder from the opening. I could tell the attic was very short, maybe 2 feet tall at most, because I was hit with a rotten smell right away, followed by another thump sound from below. I carefully climbed up and looked into the small space, which was essentially a wide, dark tunnel, and at the end by the window, I could see a figure duck down on all 4s, staring directly at me. I nearly fell off the ladder trying to. The man, who was apparently homeless, climbed the tree up to the window and made his way in, staying up there for at least a week without my knowledge. The absurdity of it all was almost unbelievable, and I moved out very quickly after that. I heard them scurrying around as I grabbed my phone and left the house, calling 911 in my driveway. Every home since, I've always looked in the attics, but the image of that man on his hands and knees at the end of the attic, staring at me with eyes that looked like both fear and Story 8 rage, has stuck with me. For the past few years, I've been working 2 jobs and usually leave my house around 6 a.m. and don't get home until 10 p.m, after which I sleep. Regretfully, I've been in this situation for a while, but this happened only a few months ago. One night, I came home and did my usual routine, which is to take a shower and get ready for bed, when I heard movement that sounded like it was just outside the bathroom door. I hurriedly got out to check, but I couldn't find anything, so I assumed it must have been the house creaking or something. After cleaning up, I went to bed, but throughout the night, I kept hearing strange noises coming from all over the house. They were mostly creaking sounds, like if there was a lot of wind outside and the house was swaying. But there was no wind and no reason for the house to be making any noise. At one point in the middle of the night, I even got up and went around to try to figure out what it was, but I couldn't find anything. In the morning, I was exhausted and had to work all day depending on by the time I got home. I was tired and drowsy and was really hoping for a good night's sleep. I went straight upstairs and turned on the shower, but before I could get in, I heard something outside the bathroom door once more. This time. I was positive it was right outside the door, and it sounded like it went straight by and left the bedroom. But even though it was improbable, it sounded like something had moved across my room, so I knew I had to check to see if someone was there. But I was so uncomfortable that when I finally plucked up the courage to look, I saw nothing. I went through the entire house and glanced in every room, but I was certain that there had to be something strange happening beneath the floorboards or inside the walls. I took a shower, went to bed, and fell asleep just before midnight. When I woke up, I knew I couldn't tell what had woken me up, but I could sense that it had something to do with the sounds I'd been hearing. I looked at the door and noticed the smallest movement of a shadow from under the crack. I jolted up and stared across the room, and my heart started racing as soon as I saw the shadow move away from the door and heard them start walking down. I slammed my bedroom door, being horrified and frozen in terror. But I think it was the adrenaline rush that forced me to get out of bed and swing open the door. I looked out and saw the dark outline of a man standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes were the only thing that truly caught my attention. They pierced through me with a sense of restlessness and rage. I locked it and heard the man's footsteps go straight down the stairs, but it took me another 30 seconds to hear him leave the house. I called the police as soon as possible, but they were unsuccessful. They only discovered a few clues that the man had been in my house for a few days at the most. I'm not sure where he was hiding, but I always remember the times I heard him pass the bathroom door. Perhaps he was sleeping in my bed, and then swiftly hiding in the closet until I showered, at which point he would use the opportunity to leave the room. I also wonder why he stayed downstairs for so long before leaving the house when he knew I had seen him and had probably called the police. At this point, everything is just conjecture, but it is terrifying to consider that a stranger was hiding in my home while I was asleep. As far as I know, the man hasn't returned, and there have been no updates regarding his Music Story 9 identity. Last year, I relocated to a new home outside of the city, and since my new job allowed me to work from home, I had no reason to spend the first few months in a crowded, pricey city. I was loving the place, especially the fact that it was so remote from other people, but one typical weekday afternoon I received a knock on my door. This was the first time someone had knocked since I had moved in, so I was a little taken aback. I went up and opened the door to a tall, middle-aged man who asked how I could help. I smiled to be friendly, assuming he was probably a neighbor from down the street, but oddly, his first action was to lean to the side, and I pulled the door in and blocked the way with my body before the man turned and left before I could say anything. I watched him walk all the way down the driveway and continue walking until he reached the street, where he got into a parked car and drove off. Without a doubt. That was the strangest encounter I'd ever had with someone up until that point, and I truly felt mortified by his behavior. I didn't know how to even consider it, so I stayed home for supper that night to make sure the man didn't return. I considered calling the police to file a report, but I felt foolish for doing so when a man approached my door at around 9 p.m. and did nothing. When I heard a voice outside, I quickly muted the TV and listened, but it was muffled, but I could still make out at least different people talking somewhere in the back of my yard. I ran up to the back window and opened the blinds, and in The distance, asterisk, I could see two figures walking across my backyard. I turned on the TV in an attempt to relax before attempting to fall asleep. They moved between the trees in my yard until they came to the side of my house. I went to the side window to try to see where they went, but I lost sight of them and they had stopped talking. I checked all the windows and still couldn't see or hear them anymore. Asterisk, the loud knocking at my front door made me jump and sent shivers down my spine. One of them was holding a long tool or object, but the other was too difficult to see clearly. Noise and peeped through the peephole. I saw a man in dark clothes with a hat over his eyes. He must have been one of the men I had just seen. But where was the other one? What do you want? I shouted, thinking they might have realized I was home, or that I might frighten them away. The man remained on the doorstep, glanced to the side of my house, and then glanced back at the door after a few seconds. When the response began to frighten me, I went back to the living room to grab my phone and call the police, but I was stopped by a loud smashing sound that kept coming. Asterisk, I turned to look across the hall and saw a man pounding a shovel against the back door. He saw me, gave me a quick glance, and fled. I was so terrified that I wasn't sure whether to call the police or not. The best course of action was to either call the police or look for a place to hide. However, my thoughts were disrupted once more when I heard a side window being struck. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the man kept hitting the window repeatedly. Everything went silent as the police arrived, and when they did, I was startled by a sudden commotion outside, which turned out to be the man at the door who had decided not to leave. On closer inspection, it turned out to be the same man who had visited earlier that day. Oddly, when the police arrested him, he repeatedly denied anything about the other man who was with him, despite the obvious cracks and dents in the doors and windows. This was annoying to hear, and weeks later, asterisk, the man was still unwilling to explain why he had visited my house twice that day, or who the other man was. There are still so many unanswered questions that it still terrifies me. I moved away in the months that followed, and ever since, I've only been hoping that it wasn't me they were after or are still after, because I was using Craigslist to sell an office chair that I no longer wanted. It wasn't broken or damaged, and it was hardly used, asterisk, but I just didn't need it anymore. Why was the man trying to break in so badly? And what purpose did the man at my doorstep serve to aid in the break-in? After a while, I received a message from a man who was interested in purchasing the chair. We spoke briefly over the phone, and he seemed like any other nice guy. He was also willing to pay my asking price, so everything seemed to be going well. We decided to meet at a nearby Walmart parking lot, which I chose to do in a public place. On Friday afternoon, asterisk, I called the man to let him know I was on my way, and I arrived at the Walmart promptly. He mentioned that he drove a grey Honda Civic, which I found to be essentially worthless. I was hoping that he would at least notice me and come over, because he knew which car I drove, but time passed and he was nowhere to be found. I texted him and called a few minutes later, but he didn't answer. Asterisk, I waited for him for almost an hour in the parking lot, but as the sun was setting, I decided to just head home for the majority of the drive, because I was irritated and upset that I had wasted my time for no apparent reason. I became anxious when I realized that car had been following me for a while, but they left me when I pulled into my street. I went inside and threw my phone and other belongings on the counter. Then I went back outside to bring the chair inside. As I was walking down my driveway, a car pulled up along the road and parked directly in front of my house. Asterisk, I couldn't be certain, but it looked a lot like the car that had been following me earlier. It was a dark red sedan that appeared to be at least 15 years old. It was old and covered in rust, so I hurriedly got my chair out of my car and went inside. Locking all the doors and closing the garage, I peered out the windows and saw that the car was just sitting in front of my house, asterisk, still running and everything. I checked my phone to see if the man had ever responded, but he hadn't, and that's when I started to feel anxious. After another minute, I heard a car door open and close, so I looked out the window once more and noticed a man dressed in dark clothing standing next to the car, but he was facing the house as though he was checking it out. After I noticed that, I closed the blinds and called 911, telling the operator that there was a strange man outside my house, and that I believed he had followed me home. I thanked them and hung up, pushed the blind up slightly and looked out the window once more. I could feel my heart pounding as I walked around to every window and looked, but it wasn't until I reached my back door that I saw the man again. He was standing inside my fenced backyard, staring up at my house. I had no idea what he was doing, but it was really unsettling, and all I could think was that he might try to break in at any moment. After a moment, the man began to walk to the side of my house. The police arrived a few minutes later, but the car was still outside my house, and the man was nowhere to be seen. To make matters worse, the car was completely empty, with not a single piece of paper or even a fingerprint inside or outside of it. I went back to the front window to see if he was going back to his car, but he didn't reappear, so I went around to every window again in an attempt to find him. The police were just as alarmed as I was, especially since the man simply vanished, leaving his car behind and making no attempt to break in. However, we can say with near certainty that it was probably the same man from the list who had followed me from the Walmart parking lot to my house using an untraceable email address and account. It has been a few months since all of this, but I'm still concerned because if he wasn't going to return anytime soon to do whatever it was he came to do, why else would he have taken the time to go over my house from all angles? Story 10, when I was 21. I made the bad choice to leave my parents' house before I could afford a place of my own. After months of searching, I came across a post on Facebook about a room for rent in my area. It was a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the 2nd bedroom. I sent him a message on Facebook and received a response in a matter of minutes. He asked a few questions. I had actually planned out 4 months looking for inexpensive apartments, roommates, and anything that could help me move out, but for some reason I just prioritized moving out on my own over everything else. The owner, Terry, was a little strange, despite being in his late 20s. He then sent over a document that looked like a lengthy list of rules for moving in, all basic stuff that is pretty much common sense. After I agreed to all the rules, he allowed Emmy to come over and look at the room that same day. I was shocked by how tidy and well put together the place was. It looked like a model house, so perfectly furnished and decorated. However, his demeanor and appearance didn't fit the house's appearance. He was wearing a filthy t-shirt and spoke in an odd manner, but I was so focused on the possibility of moving out that I didn't give a damn. A week later, I loaded up my belongings into a rental van and drove down to the house. When I arrived, I nearly thought I had entered the wrong place because it was completely empty, with only an old couch and no furnishings. The living room, completely different from the one I'd seen the first time. Terry was standing there, acting as though nothing had changed, and he was talking to me about how happy he was to have a roommate. I asked him about the furniture and everything, but he essentially ignored me and just started moving my belongings into the house. I was a little uncomfortable, but I moved in anyway, and over the course of several weeks, I hardly ever saw Terry. Terry was constantly working and didn't get home until late at night, but after a month or so, I began to notice that he was only sometimes arriving home, perhaps once a week, at around 2 or 3 in the morning. A part of me didn't care that he would spend some time downstairs before leaving and not returning for another week or 2, because I was, despite my happiness at having the house to myself, I couldn't help but wonder what he was up to. After all, he really wanted me to move in, but he's never been here since. Then one night at 2 in the morning, Terry knocked on my bedroom door a few weeks after I'd last seen him, and screaming my name, I hurried over to Terry who was standing in the doorway with a furious expression and perspiration running down his head. "Do not leave your room," he said harshly, then grabbed the door and tore the handle from my grasp, slamming it shut. I stood there in disbelief as I heard him go downstairs. I opened the door silently, and a few seconds later, I heard him dragging something heavy across the floor, and I ran downstairs to investigate what was happening. I saw a smear of dirt and mud covering the kitchen and leading up to the garage door. I attempted to open it, but he managed to lock it from inside. I decided it would be best to just leave the scene and fled to my car, calling the police. By the time they arrived at the house, Terry had already left and the smears on the floor had been cleaned. After a few days of research, it was discovered that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else, which prevented me from legally moving in. All of the documents he sent me and had me sign were phony, and Terry probably wasn't his real name either. As far as I know, he never returned, so I'm not sure what he was up to, but he was so insistent that I stay in my room that night, and his disappearance after that made it obvious that he had something terrible he was concealing. But what baffles me is why he wanted me to come in and live with him so strongly. I can't help but believe that he had plans for me, but I barely managed to leave before learning about them the hard way. Story 11. Due to financial difficulties, I was unable to travel to the new city 3 years ago, but since I was only renting, there wasn't much risk involved. The movers arrived in mid-September, loaded everything, and dropped it off at the house. The landlord was kind enough to let me unload it, since I wouldn't be arriving there until the following week. It was a Monday evening when I finally arrived and saw the house in its new location. When I first arrived, the house was a mess with boxes everywhere and furniture scattered everywhere, but the house itself was fine. The layout was intriguing because it was one story, with the living room and kitchen on one side and a long hallway, with all the bedrooms and bathrooms on the other. Since it was already late, I went to the master bedroom and began assembling the bed before turning off the lights and going to bed without setting up a clock. I'm not sure what time it was, but I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. I assumed it was something the house was making, but I wanted to find out what it was and whether I needed to notify the landlord. I got up and went to the room door, but as I got closer, I realized it was coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened the door, and it stopped almost immediately. The hallway was completely dark, so I turned on the light, but nothing was there. It took me some time to fall asleep again, because I kept thinking about how the sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. I went back to the bedroom after slowly walking down and looking into the living room, which appeared to be the same it had earlier. However, I turned on the lights and checked the floor to make sure there were many footprints scattered between the boxes that were lying around. I knew that these were probably from the movers. Any possible explanation for this could be the house making noises, but I couldn't think of anything when I fell back asleep. It felt like I was only asleep for a minute before I was startled awake by a thumb followed by footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes snapped open, and I turned to face my bedroom door, which was wide open, and I saw that there were obvious footprints on the floor leading directly up to my bed. I quickly got up to see who was there, but by the time I did, they had already left, leaving only scuffs, footprints from them fleeing. So I grabbed my phone, called the police, and locked myself in the bathroom until they came. Strangely, they didn't find any evidence of a break-in other than the footprints. So I reasoned that they must have gotten in during the week before I got to the house. But even after unpacking and inspecting every box, nothing seemed to be missing. The landlord was willing to let me break the contract and vacate the property, as long as I didn't disclose the break-in to anyone at the time. It sounded like he didn't want anyone to be scared away from the house, so that he wouldn't lose out on his rental income. But now is the biggest mystery. Why did they walk up to my bed? And what was that thump sound I heard just before they fled? I'm not really sure, but story 12 occurred a few years ago when I was 26 years old. My mother, who was the only kid, had recently died, and their house was left for me to either move into or sell. I couldn't afford much at the time, so I was living in a really bad apartment. After much consideration, I made the decision to move into the house, which was already paid off, so I was saving a significant amount of money by doing so. My plan was to possibly save money for a few years, get back on my feet, then sell it and buy the house I wanted. After my lease at the apartment ended, I moved across town to the house, which was located in a community of proprietors of farmland, but in recent years, the majority of that land had ceased to be used for farming and was left as empty fields. This also happened with my mother's land, which was essentially just an old barn-style house in the middle of a large field with only a little overgrown path leading to it. During my first week there, I spent most of my time cleaning and organizing my belongings. One night, as I was cleaning, I heard a car approaching me. I noticed an old pickup truck driving down the overgrown path outside the house. It was odd, because the only reason they would have driven here would have been to get to the house. But as they got to the end of the path, they slowed down. I could see a man in the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out any details. They stayed there for a while, their headlights shining over the field, before making a three-point turn and leaving. I assumed they probably simply typed in the incorrect address or something, but it was a little unsettling to see someone coming so late at night. A few days passed, and by that time, I had finished organizing and cleaning the house. It was a Sunday night, and I was eating a home-cooked meal and watching TV when I heard a familiar sound, a car approaching the house. I looked out the window once more and saw, knowing that it couldn't be an accident. I was further concerned when I noticed that same pickup truck driving down the route with all of its headlights off. I instantly checked my phone and saw that it was almost 1 a.m. Consequently, why would, when the truck reached the front of the house and parked, a man asked if anyone was coming out and began to approach the porch. I waited tensely, but when the doorbell and hammering stopped, I carefully approached the front door and peered out using a peephole. A man stood straight on the porch and gazed at the door, and I was frightened because he appeared to be thinking about something before he turned around and hurried back to his truck to get in. I contacted the police and reported it because I was so frightened, but because there was nothing else I could do. I went to bed that night feeling pretty depressed about everything, and it turns out that I was correct, because I believed there had been a knock on the door when I woke up, but it was after hearing a single tap. I immediately sprang up and peered out the window, but the truck that I had anticipated seeing wasn't outside the home, so I stealthily went from my bedroom to try and down the stairs to find out who it was. But as soon as I got to the top of the stairs, I halted when I noticed that the front door was slightly open, and a short while after, I immediately hid in the spare bedroom next to me as I heard footsteps moving in the corridor below me. Called 911 when the sounds of footfall increased and began to ascend the stairs. They entered the main bedroom right away, and I could hear them rearranging things as if they were trying to find. I just sat there because I was too afraid to talk to the cop on the phone for fear that the intruder might hear me. They went through the bedroom in silence for a few minutes before departing, returning downstairs and eventually leaving to visit the house where I had begun chatting. I hurried up to the rear window to try to identify the cop before they got. Even though it was dark outside, I could tell that the man was the same one who had been on my porch earlier. He was strolling toward the tall grass area in the backyard. Police arrived after it eventually vanished and looked for any evidence to support the case, but all I had to go on was my description of the man. Helpful, that man looked to be searching for something special, which makes me wonder. I'm not sure what he wanted. Perhaps he planned to steal anything my mother owned after learning of her dying, but after I realized, knowing that I was home, he must have entered the bedroom, and the thought of him doing so still frightened me. Examining my surroundings to see what he would do to me if I remained in, who was too afraid of his coming there. so I sold the house a month later. I continue to check every few months to see if there have been any reports since then of recent burglaries at that home, but after then, everything has been peaceful. Evening 4.